The dog refused to leave the abandoned lighthouse. When they got in, they found a war medal. There are stories that howl through history like wind through an empty lighthouse, unheard until someone finally listens. This is one of them. In today's story on Hero Paws 77, we follow an old German shepherd who refused to leave an abandoned lighthouse. But when 4 veterans arrived, what they uncovered changed everything. Hidden beneath stone and silence was a war medal, a forgotten name, and a dog who had waited a lifetime to keep his promise. This isn't just a story about a dog. It's a story about memory, about loyalty that outlives war, and about the hearts that do not sleep, even when the world forgets them. This video holds one of the most meaningful lessons we've ever shared. Stay with us to the end. Let it find a place in you. If it moves you, leave a comment and help us reach 10,000 subscribers so we can continue telling stories that deserve to be heard. Every year, when autumn began to lay its first rust-colored leaves across the still gray waters of Seabridge Bay, the same whisper moved through the coastal town. The lighthouse lit up again, not with electricity, not with any navigational beacon, but with something older, a memory that refused to dim, coming from the eyes of a dog who still sat there, night after night, on the moss-covered stone steps of a long-abandoned tower. Locals called him Scout. No one owned him. No one fed him regularly. No one could quite remember when he first showed up. But nearly everyone had heard the barking, steady, measured, not frantic or pleading, echoing across the shore from that lighthouse. Some called it haunting. Others called it loyal. But those who had lost someone in their life, well, they just called it familiar. Walter Grady heard that bark for the first time 3 years ago, on the night his wife Nancy passed. He'd been sitting alone on their porch, a half-empty mug of tea cooling beside him, when the sound drifted across the wind. 3 short barks, then silence, as if someone far away was checking in, or calling him home. He never told anyone. Folks around here didn't ask many questions anyway, and if they had, they'd just think he was imagining things. Seabridge was a town built on memory. There were fishermen who still kept a place set at the table for sons lost at sea. There was a woman who, every Tuesday, polished her late husband's war medals like clockwork. There was a hill where children still laid wildflowers each May for soldiers they never knew. Walter, now 71, had been a soldier once, too. He'd served near Da Nang in 1968, where a landmine took the lives of 3 of his buddies, and left him with a lifetime of insomnia. After his discharge, he taught music at the local high school. Then he retired early to take care of Nancy. And when she left, so did the music. So did the reason to wake up early. All that remained was a creaky rocking chair on the porch, the scent of salt air, and that bark, once a stranger, now a companion. He'd started calling the dog Scout, though he'd never seen him. The name just felt right. Something in the sound of that bark reminded Walter of the scout dogs he'd seen in the war. Loyal, sharp, the kind of presence you didn't notice until it was the only thing standing between you and death. The strange thing was, he felt like he knew the dog, not in a rational way. More like an old feeling stirring in the chest. Like when you smell honeysuckle and remember a porch swing from 50 years ago. One early October night, when the bay was draped in fog thick enough to hide the horizon, Walter couldn't sleep again. The wind whipped through the trees with a sharpness that made his bones ache. He stepped outside wrapped in a flannel shirt, pouring hot coffee into a thermos, the old army-grade kind with dents that each held a story. Out across the dark water, the lighthouse stood crooked and silent, paint peeling, the glass at the top long gone. It hadn't worked in decades, not since modern systems had made it obsolete. But to Walter, it still meant something. A sentinel, a keeper, a place that outlasted storms, even if no one thanked it for doing so. And then the bark came again, 3 times. Crisp, certain, not asking, not warning, just calling. This time, Walter didn't just sit and listen. He felt something tug, not on his body, but somewhere deeper, a pressure in the chest, a whisper in the gut. He went back inside and pulled out an old military tin from beneath his bed. Inside, a folded topographical map, a compass, a small flashlight, a pack of dry jerky, and a photo of Nancy tucked into his field Bible. He stared at the photo a moment longer than usual. Then he zipped up his coat, tucked the supplies into an old rucksack, and stepped out into the fog. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but his feet seemed to know. The next morning, in the corner booth at Maple Street Diner, where Roy ordered his black coffee and oatmeal without fail every morning, Walter slid into the seat across from him. Roy, grizzled and hard of hearing in one ear from a grenade blasted nom, barely looked up. "You look like you saw a ghost," he said. Walter didn't answer at first. He just poured hot coffee from his thermos into a chipped diner mug and placed it gently on the table. "I think I met the dog," Walter said. Roy blinked, pausing mid-spoonful. Thomas and Carl, both seated nearby, fellow veterans and longtime friends, leaned in. They didn't laugh. They didn't ask him if he'd taken his meds. These were men who had long ago learned that not every truth comes with evidence. Walter took a slow sip, his voice lower this time. "He knew me, that's the thing. I've never seen him before. But last night, he looked at me like I'd left him behind." No one spoke for a while. The hum of the coffee machine and the clink of forks on ceramic filled the silence. Then Carl, the most skeptical of the group, said something none of them expected. "Well, maybe we ought to go see him." Walter looked up, surprised. Carl shrugged. "Something tells me that dog ain't waiting for just anyone." And just like that, four old men, each with their own regrets and half-forgotten memories, found themselves preparing for a quiet pilgrimage toward a lighthouse no longer in use, guided by the bark of a dog who didn't belong to anyone and maybe never had, but belonged there. The air smelled like rust and brine. It was early afternoon when the four of them arrived at the path leading to the lighthouse, each carrying more than what was in their hands. The walk from the edge of Seabridge down to the coastline wasn't long, but it felt like crossing a line drawn in time. Behind them, the quiet town that kept its stories folded and polite. Ahead, the place that hadn't spoken in decades, but still remembered everything. Walter walked first, his boots heavy but sure. Behind him came Roy, wearing the same battered army cap he'd worn since 1973, the brim now sun-faded and fraying. Carl, limping slightly from a bad knee that never quite healed after a rooftop fall in Jersey, followed next. And Thomas, the quietest of them all, brought up the rear, his small leather notebook tucked under one arm like a Bible. None of them talked much as they walked. They didn't need to. Sometimes, among men who have known loss, silence speaks best. The trail curved toward the cliffs, where yellow grasses bent low in the sea wind. From a distance, the lighthouse stood like a forgotten sentry, tall, salt-streaked, half-draped in creeping ivy. The windows were dark. The metal railing at the top rusted through in several places. And yet, the place had a kind of stillness that wasn't empty. It felt watched. It felt waiting. Walter stopped at the gate. "You all right?" Carl asked gently. Walter nodded, but didn't move. His eyes had landed on a patch of sand just beyond the broken gate. There were paw prints. Fresh. They led toward the base of the tower, disappeared into the overgrowth, then circled back as if pacing. Not frantic, but steady, like patrol. "He's here," Walter murmured. Roy grunted, stepping forward. "Well, let's not keep the old boy waiting." The gate groaned as they pushed through. Sea grass brushed against their knees. Carl muttered about the wind getting into his bones. Thomas remained quiet, scribbling something short in his book before slipping it back into his coat. When they reached the stone steps, they stopped. There, lying in the exact center of the entryway, where the steps met the cracked threshold, was a German shepherd. Gray dusted its muzzle, and one who was notched like it had once tangled with wire or barbed fence. It didn't bark. It didn't move. It simply looked up at them, calm, still, like it had been expecting them. Walter crouched down slowly, knees creaking. He didn't speak. He only held out his hand, palm up, eyes level. The dog rose without hesitation and walked a few short feet toward him. It did not sniff or test. It simply pressed its head against Walter's knee, then sat beside him, like it belonged there. The wind shifted. The grass leaned toward the sea. and none of the men said a word for several heartbeats. Finally, Carl let out a slow breath. "Well, I'll be damned. I think," Roy said quietly. "He's been waiting a long time for someone to come back." They entered the lighthouse with Scout. The name now settled like it had always been his. The main chamber was stripped bare. Dust hung in sunbeams that filtered through the broken glass of the upper window. Wooden stairs spiraled up and down, some steps cracked, others entirely missing. A metal lantern long, since rusted out, sat in the corner, webbed over with time. Walter's eyes moved toward the door under the staircase. A cellar, maybe. He turned to Scout. "Is that it?" Scout looked at the door, then padded over to it. He sat, and he waited. Carl looked at Walter. "After you." The door groaned open on a second tug. A wave of cold air drifted up, damp and smelling of old paper and stone. They moved slowly, flashlights sweeping through the darkness as they descended. What they found was not chaos. It was a room carefully left behind. There was a single cot against one wall, the blanket folded sharp at the edges, a tin cup on a crate that must have served as a table, and in the corner, underneath a canvas sheet, a wooden trunk with brass latches. Walter stepped toward it, like approaching something sacred. He hesitated only once before unclipping the latch and lifting the lid. Inside, a tightly folded American flag, a silver star medal, and a weathered leather-bound journal. On top of all, there lay a sealed envelope, yellow with age, edges curled, but the ink still clear. "To Mary, my light when the sea was dark." Thomas exhaled softly behind him. "James Reed's," he whispered. That was the name. H-577. Missing in action. Korea, 1952. Roy blinked. "How do you know that?" Thomas gently opened his notebook. Inside was a clipped article, brown with time, an obituary with no photo. It mentioned the Jane Mary Reeds of Seabridge, widow. "I keep names," he said. "It's a habit." Walter sat down on the edge of the cot. The dog came and lay at his feet. He opened the journal. Pages of slanted, strong handwriting filled the worn paper. Entries about long nights on the sea. Letters unsent. Songs whistled in the dark to stay sane. And names. So many names. Most of them crossed out with lines that trembled at the end. But then a drawing rough, shaded with pencil, of a dog. The same notched ear. The same solemn eyes. "Scout." Walter turned another page. And there, taped to the paper, was a photograph. 4 young men, standing on a beach. One of them was Walter. No doubt. Same crooked smile. Same scar on his left temple. But he didn't remember this photo. Didn't remember meeting James Reeds. And yet, there he was, caught in silver grains. He looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was there." Thomas nodded. "But something or someone didn't want you to remember." "Not yet." Scout raised his head then, looking toward the staircase. Not toward the exit, but up, as if the story wasn't finished. As if something or someone was still waiting to be seen. It wasn't just a trunk. Not anymore. The moment Walter lifted the lid, something in the air shifted, like the room itself exhaled for the first time in decades. Dust rose in a thin shimmer, catching the shaft of light that filtered through a cracked ceiling beam above. The 4 men stood silently around the chest, as if opening it had summoned something sacred or sleeping. Inside it was all neat, purposeful, left that way not by accident, but by someone who once believed, perhaps naively, that they would return for it someday. There was a folded U.S. Navy uniform, still bearing the name tag, Reed's, J.A., a small stack of sepia-tone letters, bound with twine, a weather-beaten leather journal, and tucked beneath the corner of a folded wool blanket, a photograph. Walter lifted it with care. His hand trembled slightly. The photo was creased down the middle, as if it had been opened and closed 100 times. 4 men stood on a beach, laughing young, squinting into the sun. One of them, unmistakably, was Walter himself. He stared at it for a long time. He couldn't remember ever taking this photograph. But the man in the picture had his eyes, his old smirk, the scar near his left temple from the shrapnel incident in '69. He handed it to Thomas, who looked closely. then nodded. "It's you," Thomas said, voice low, "but younger. Maybe 2021. Carl leaned in. "That looks like Pensacola. I'd know that shoreline anywhere." Roy squinted. "Who's the man second from the left?" Walter didn't answer right away. He turned to Scout, who was sitting quietly at the far end of the room, staring at the trunk, not moving, as if guarding it still. He knew, somehow, who the man was. James Arthur Reed's. The name had begun to surface more and more over the past few days, like something rising from cold, deep water. It wasn't just in the journal or the letters, or even the plaque Thomas had shown him back in town. It was in flashes, half-remembered glances, laughter in the barracks, a voice behind him in a mess hall, things Walter hadn't consciously thought about in 50 years. Walter picked up the journal. The leather was cracked along the spine. He opened to the first page. Seabridge Lighthouse. April 17, 1951. He turned a few pages. The handwriting was tight and careful. Navy style. The words spoke of long watches, shifting weather patterns, and night currents. But mixed in were glimpses of a quieter life. Mentions of Mary, his wife. Her lemon tea. The way she used to read poetry aloud while he cleaned his boots. How she left fresh bread by the window each Sunday for the gulls. And then, scattered throughout, sketches of a dog. Always the same one. A lean German shepherd with dark markings around his eyes and a small notch on one ear. Scout. Walter turned another page. The dreams are back. The ocean no longer sings at night. I hear only silence. And in that silence, I sometimes hear the boys I left behind. The words hit hard, not because they were unfamiliar, but because they felt like Walter could have written them himself. Roy broke the quiet. "Walt, if Reed's was declared MIA in 1952 and this journal goes past that, then someone didn't get the truth." Walter nodded, but his gaze didn't leave the page. He found an entry dated January 1953. "I returned. They told me not to. They said I wasn't the same. I agreed." Carl stepped forward. "Returned? Returned from where?" Thomas pulled a folded paper from the side of the trunk, a military discharge form. Faded, edges torn, but still readable. It had James Reed's name on it, and it was never signed. There was also a clipping, a copy of a hospital record from a VA psych unit in Albany. A handwritten note across the top in blue ink. No next of kin. Placed under provisional care. No memory of service. Roy exhaled. They buried him in paper. That's how you lose a man. One missing form at a time. Walter said nothing. His hands moved slowly, gently, through the rest of the chest. He found Mary's scarf, still faintly lavender-scented, and a pocket Bible, the kind the Navy issued back then. But it was a sealed letter that finally made him pause. He looked down at the envelope again. "To Mary, my light when the sea was dark." The handwriting was steady, strong. It hadn't been mailed. With quiet permission from the others, Walter opened it. The letter was written in ink that had barely faded. One page, both sides. It spoke of regret, that James had felt broken upon return, that he couldn't go back to her, not like that he had instead come back to the Lighthouse, the only place that had held both of them together. It spoke of Scout, and how the dog had waited outside the hospital for weeks until the staff allowed him in. How the dog had remained with him through the quiet unraveling. And then one line, simple near the end. If you're reading this, it means Scout kept his watch. The silence in the room deepened. Carl sat down on a crate, shoulders hunched forward. Thomas scribbled something softly into his notebook. Roy stared at the cracked floor, blinking once, slowly. Walter looked at Scout. The old dog was still watching the chest, still sitting guard. He reached out, placed a hand gently on the shepherd's back, and whispered, "You did good, boy." Scout didn't wag his tail. He didn't move. He simply leaned into the hand, eyes half closed, as if some long-held weight had lifted, just enough to let him breathe. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the lighthouse windows, but the room remained still. Roy cleared his throat. "So what now?" Walter stood. "We don't leave him in paper." Walter had seen many things in his life. The chaos of battlefields, the slow unraveling of marriage under the weight of illness, the kind of silence that settles in a house after the last breath is taken. But standing in that small, stone-walled room beneath a forgotten lighthouse, holding the letter a man lost to history, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the unmistakable ache of memory trying to surface. They stayed there for some time, the four of them and the dog. No one said much after the letter. There wasn't anything to say that didn't already live in the air around them. Carl traced the edge of the trunk with his weathered hand, as if touching the wood might confirm what his mind still resisted. Roy sat on an overturned crate, shoulders hunched, staring at the military discharge form like it had betrayed him personally. And Thomas, ever the observer, was writing lines of something quiet and spare, lines meant only for the page and the person he would become when he was alone. Walter was the only one standing, still holding the envelope. "What if I met him?" he said at last, voice low, not quite looking up. "What if I did know James, and I just don't remember?" Silence. Then Roy, gruff and skeptical, muttered, "You saying you forgot an entire man?" Walter nodded, slowly. "I'm saying maybe I forgot myself." That landed harder than any of them expected. Carl shifted in place, uncomfortable. Roy looked away. Only Scout responded, lifting his head from the floor and walking over to Walter, placing his chin gently on the man's boot. It was Thomas who finally broke the silence. "Do you remember the VA hospital in Albany? Back in the early 80s? Walter looked over. "I remember pieces." "Why?" Thomas pulled a thin folder from his coat pocket. It was old, the paper inside worn, folded too many times. "There was a man there," he said. "No name, no rank. He'd been found wandering near a freight yard. Couldn't say who he was. But every night he'd hum the same song. And every morning he'd sit by the window and look east toward the water." He passed the folder to Walter. Inside was a copy of a file, minimal notes, just enough to be tragic. Under name, unknown. Under known associates, none. Under recurrent behavior, fixation on lighthouses. Uses the name Mary, repeatedly in moments of lucidity. Walter's breath caught in his throat. That was the same year he'd been admitted for insomnia and stress-related migraines. Same hospital, same wing. "I shared a room with someone," he whispered. "He never spoke to me, but I remember he had this presence, like he was watching the coast even from 100 miles inland." Roy straightened. "You think that was James?" "I don't think," Walter said. "I know." Carl folded his arms, voice cautious. "So, he made it back, just not all the way." Walter nodded. "He came back broken. Not because he wanted to be, but because no one was there to help him find the pieces. So he came here, the only place that ever made sense." Outside, the wind picked up, whispering along the outer walls like the sea itself had leaned in to listen. Roy stood, rubbing his jaw. "So what do we do now? We can't unbury the past." "Not entirely." Thomas closed his notebook. "No," he said, "but we can name it." That night, the men sat around Walter's fireplace. The dog curled at their feet. They passed around old photos, some of them dug from boxes in garages and basements, others taken from the trunk. As the flames flickered low, they began to speak aloud what had never been spoken, about the nights they couldn't sleep, the dreams they never told their wives about, the friends they remembered only when it rained. Carl admitted that he kept an old pair of boots by his door, not for himself, but for the man who once saved his life and didn't make it home. Roy, quietly, shared that he hadn't visited his brother's grave in 30 years because he couldn't stand the guilt of coming back when his brother hadn't. Even Thomas, who rarely let words slip beyond ink, said he still wrote letters to a girl he loved in Saigon. Letters he never sent, letters that always ended with, "If you're still out there, I hope the ocean was kind." Walter listened, then spoke last. "I spent my whole life believing I was the one left behind," he said. "But maybe I was just the one who came back too soon." Scout looked up then, as if in understanding. Walter placed a hand on his head and felt the warmth, steady and real. The next morning they made the call. Through a local veterans registry and with help from a state archivist who had once served herself, they began the process of identifying the unknown veteran buried in Albany as James Arthur Reed's. DNA testing, military cross-referencing, even an old dental record helped piece together the story. Weeks passed. The story spread. Local papers picked it up first. Dog guards Lighthouse for years. Truth reveals lost soldiers' legacy. Then came the national outlets. The story resonated, not just because of Scout or James or the old Lighthouse, but because it echoed something many people carried. The fear of being forgotten and the hope that someone would remember. A date was set for a reburial. The Department of Veterans Affairs approved a formal ceremony. James Reed's would finally receive a headstone bearing his name, his service, his story. But Walter had a different idea. He belongs here, he said. This place, this is where his story ends and begins. No one argued. So, with the help of a small foundation, they erected a stone marker at the foot of the lighthouse. Simple, quiet. Just a name, a date, and a line from a letter. If you are reading this, it means Scout kept his watch. They buried the flag, the journal, and the photograph in a time capsule beneath the stone. Scout lay beside it the whole time, unmoving. When it was over, Walter sat in the grass, looking out at the sea. He didn't cry. Not really. But his eyes didn't blink for a long time. And when Scout came and rested his head in Walter's lap, it felt, for the first time in years, like the silence meant something good. Like maybe it was okay, finally, to let the past rest. The morning of the ceremony arrived draped in fog. It rolled in off the Atlantic like a veil, soft, ghost-colored, and nearly still. The lighthouse, old and stoic as ever, stood like a worn sentinel in the hush of dawn. Gulls circled but didn't cry. Even the ocean seemed to hush its voice. Walter was the first to arrive. He came with a small bouquet of wildflowers, not store-bought, but gathered from the fields behind his house that Nancy once called the untamed part of heaven. His hands trembled a little as he placed them at the foot of the new marker, a modest granite stone now nestled into the earth where the time capsule was buried. James Arthur Reed's, 1929 to 1997. Scout kept the watch. The words were etched plainly, without flourish, but to Walter, they held the weight of 100 unspoken prayers. Scout lay beside the stone, head resting between his paws, his body curled into the kind of stillness only old dogs know. His fur had grown grayer over the past few weeks, his walk slower, his eyes softer but not dimmer. He'd been waiting for this. By mid-morning, others arrived. Carl came with a folded flag, pressed fresh that morning. Roy brought a harmonica, the same one he carried in his rucksack through 2 tours. And Thomas, always quiet, always deliberate, brought nothing but a small leather-bound journal with a ribbon around it. They stood in a circle. No podium, no speeches, only the sound of wind threading through dune grass and the occasional creak of the lighthouse settling into the day. Walter cleared his throat. I didn't know James in the way a brother might, he began, but somehow I remember him now in the way a brother should. He looked down at Scout. This dog, this soul, waited a lifetime to complete a promise. No command, no leash, just memory. Roy lifted the harmonica. For a few seconds, it hung in the air like a question. Then he brought it to his lips and played, slow and aching, the melody of taps. But softer, like a lullaby for the forgotten. Carl knelt and unfolded the flag across the stone. This should have been done 70 years ago, he murmured. Thomas said nothing. Instead, he stepped forward and placed his journal gently at the base of the marker. His story's in here, he said. Not just his, all of ours. They stood in silence afterward, not out of obligation, but because it felt holy. And then something happened. Scout, who had not moved since sunrise, stood. His legs shook, but he held himself tall. He looked at each of the men in turn, then turned toward the sea. He walked a few steps forward, to the edge where the cliffs broke and the waves hissed below, and sat. There was something in his posture that Walter would never forget, a kind of surrender, but also a kind of peace. And then the dog did something none of them had seen before. He howled, not loud, not wild, Just one long, aching note that lifted into the mist, like a thread tying this moment to all the ones that had been lost. It wasn't a cry of pain. It was a goodbye. Walter walked over and sat beside him. "You did good, Scout," he whispered. "You're free now." Scout leaned into him, the old weight of a tired friend, and closed his eyes. For a moment, Walter thought that would be it. But then the dog stood again, slower this time, and walked back toward the lighthouse door. He stopped, turned, and looked back once. Then, with surprising calm, he lay down in the entryway where they first found him, right in the sunlight. And there he stayed. Walter kept vigil the rest of the day. People came and went, veterans from other towns, a mother who had lost her son in Iraq, a boy who said he wanted to be a sailor one day. Each left something, a flower, a patch, a prayer, but Scout didn't rise again. When the sun dipped into the sea, golden and generous, Walter knew. He knelt down beside the dog, pressed a hand to his fur, still warm, and whispered, "Go home. Buddy, he's waiting for you." Roy came and placed the harmonica beside him. Carl draped the corner of the flag gently over his back. Thomas opened his journal, wrote one final line, and closed it without reading it aloud. They buried Scout the next morning, right beside James. No fanfare, just a carved piece of driftwood, smooth and worn, with the words, "Loyal to the end." After the burial, Walter stayed behind while the others returned to town. He sat in the grass, eyes on the water, the sea air brushing softly against his skin. For the first time in years, he didn't feel haunted. He felt remembered. A week later, he received a letter from a woman in Oregon. She'd read the news story and recognized the name, James Arthur Reed's. Her aunt had been Mary Reed's, James's wife. She'd passed away in 2003, but had always kept a room ready, a light on in the hall, and a photograph of a man in uniform on her dresser. Walter folded the letter and placed it inside the trunk they decided to preserve in the lighthouse. It would remain there, along with Scout's collar and the harmonica, as part of a local exhibit to honor those forgotten by war, and the animals who waited for them. In the final entry of Thomas's journal, later published in a local veteran anthology, he wrote, "There are dogs who fight and dogs who guard. But once in a while, there is one who remembers. And because of him, we remember too." The seasons changed with a kind of grace Walter hadn't noticed in years. The cold crept in like it always did after October, softening the edges of the grass near the lighthouse and turning the sky a paler kind of blue. But there was no bitterness in it now. Not for him. It felt earned, like a rest after long labor, like exhale after holding too much in the chest for too many years. Scout was gone, but not gone. His collar still hung by the old coat rack in Walter's entryway, brass nameplate polished, the leather looped over a hook that once held Nancy's sun hat. Sometimes, when Walter walked past it in the quiet of evening, he would reach out and let his fingers trail across it. It didn't bring sadness. It brought steadiness. The story had traveled. Not viral, not flashy, but slow, deliberate, the way a tide moves in the dark. A local journalist had written a piece titled "The Dog Who Waited," and from there, people from across the state began to visit the lighthouse. Some came out of curiosity. Others came with photos folded in wallets, names etched into dog tags, silences that wanted somewhere safe to land. And one afternoon, it brought a boy. Walter was sitting on the bench near the lighthouse base, a thermos of coffee in hand, when he saw the child climbing the hill, maybe 10 years old, maybe younger, a bit small for his backpack, but he walked with purpose, the kind of sure-footedness only children and old souls possess. Beside him trotted a puppy, not quite coordinated, ears too big for his head, tail sweeping side to side like a pendulum with no hurry, a golden shepherd mix, soft brown eyes and a small patch of white under the chin. Walter didn't speak. He waited. The boy stopped a few feet from him and took off his cap. "Are you Mr. Walter Grady?" he asked. Walter smiled. "That's what they call me." The boy sat on the grass cross-legged, the puppy flopping down beside him. "My mom read your story on the internet. She cried. I didn't cry, but I thought about it a lot." Walter nodded, sipping his coffee. Thinking is its own kind of feeling. The boy looked toward the headstone near the lighthouse wall. Is that where the soldier's buried? That's right. Is the dog really buried next to him? Walter looked over. Yes, right where the sun hits in the morning. They sat quietly for a while. The waves below the cliffside murmured their slow lullaby. My name's Eli, the boy said, and this is Huck. Huck. Walter raised a brow. Short for Huckleberry. He's my first dog. Walter gave a small chuckle. That's a good name. Feels like he's meant for wandering. I think so, too, Eli said seriously. He always tries to sneak out the back gate, but he comes back when I whistle. They lapsed into quiet again. Then Eli asked, without turning his head, Did you ever meet the soldier? Walter stared out to sea for a long moment. I think I did. Once. A long time ago. I just didn't remember it until recently. Did the dog remember? Walter smiled, that deep, fragile kind of smile that lives near the ribs. He never forgot. The boy let that settle. Then he stood and walked toward the stone. He knelt beside it and reached into his backpack, pulling out a folded piece of paper. It looked worn at the edges, maybe drawn on more than once. Erased, redrawn. He laid it at the base of the headstone. Walter joined him slowly, knees crackling as he knelt. It was a drawing of a lighthouse, a man in uniform, and beside him, a dog. The boy had written underneath in neat block letters, Thank you for waiting. Walter's throat tightened. He placed a hand gently on Eli's shoulder. You gave him something today, he said, something that doesn't wear out. Eli turned. What's that? A future. The puppy nosed his way forward and lay beside the drawing, tail thumping once, then still. That night, Walter returned home and did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled out his old piano bench and wiped away the dust. The keys were slightly out of tune. The higher notes had a tinniness that age always brings. But the lower ones, the ones that carried the weight, still held firm. He played slow, no sheet music, just chords remembered from rainy nights and songs Nancy used to hum in the kitchen. Halfway through, he stopped and looked over at the coat rack. The collar still hung there, but this time he didn't reach for it. He simply nodded. Weeks passed. The town created a small exhibit in the community center. They called it the Watch a Scout. The trunk from the lighthouse was placed beneath glass, surrounded by photos, notes, medals. But it was the small things that stopped people longest. A dog tag, a drawing crayon, a letter left by a stranger that simply read, Because of you, I called my dad. Walter didn't speak much at the opening. He stood in the back, hands in his coat pockets, listening, watching. And then he saw Eli, dressed in a clean button-up shirt, hair combed stiff. Huck trotted beside him, leash loose, but unnecessary. When Eli spotted Walter, he smiled and held something up, a notebook. Look, he said, flipping through the pages. I started writing stuff down. About Huck, about today, like Thomas did. Walter leaned down, reading the messy scrawl. You're doing good work, he said. Writing helps things stay. Stay where? In the heart. Eli nodded. That's where I want it. Walter tousled the boy's hair. Then that's where it'll live. By the time spring returned to Seabridge, the wind had softened. Where once it howled between rooftops and rattled loose shutters like ghosts shaking out grief, now it moved gently, like fingers through tall grass, like breath against skin. The tide came in slower, less hurried. The sea, too, seemed quieter. Walter noticed these things now. He moved slower, but not in a way that made people worry. More like a man who finally knew there was no rush. He still climbed the path to the lighthouse every few days, thermos in hand, scarf looped once instead of twice. Not out of habit, but out of gratitude. He never brought flowers, never lit candles. He simply sat, on the bench, beside the marker, looking out to sea like Scout once did. And when he sat there, people began to join. One morning it was Eli again, with Huck now nearly grown. Legs longer, chest broader, tail still wagging as if he hadn't yet realized he was becoming a full dog. Eli came carrying a book under one arm, the leather journal Walter had seen him start months ago. He opened it in front of Walter, pages fluttering in the wind like wings. "I want to read you something," he said, adjusting his ball cap. "It's not finished, but I'm close." Walter nodded. "Go on, then." Eli cleared his throat and read. "Some dogs don't just guard people. Some dogs guard time. They wait at doorways we forget. They remember things we lose on purpose. They love in the spaces between wars. And when their watch is over, they teach someone else to keep it." Walter blinked once. "That's real good, kid." Eli shrugged. "I don't know if it makes sense." "It does," Walter said. "To the right kind of people, it will." Huck dropped a stick at Walter's feet, tail thumping against a bench leg. Without thinking, Walter picked it up and tossed it into the wind. The dog chased it with delight, paws spraying sand. Eli closed his notebook and looked toward the sea. "Do you think Scout ever got tired of waiting?" Walter didn't answer right away. "I think," he said slowly, "Scout knew something most of us forget, that waiting isn't wasted when it's done out of love." Eli tilted his head. "How do you know?" Walter smiled. "Because he never looked sad." That summer, the Seabridge Town Council voted to keep the Lighthouse standing, not just as a historic structure, but as a place of remembrance. A small wooden sign was carved and placed near the entrance. "The Watch, for those who waited and those who still do." People came from other towns, sometimes just to see the view, but often to leave things: a name on a scrap of paper, a pair of dog tags, a pressed flower. One woman drove 5 hours just to lay her late father's military cap beside the stone, whispering. He used to talk in his sleep about a dog he lost in Nam. I like to think maybe they met again. Thomas visited often, notebook always in hand, always watching. He published their story the following fall under a simple title, Hearts That Do Not Sleep. It was not a bestseller. It was not made into a movie, but in veterans' homes and quiet corners of small libraries, it was passed gently from hand to hand, not because it entertained, but because it remembered. Carl passed away that winter, quietly, in his chair by the window, a newspaper folded across his lap, and a photo of Scout in a frame beside him. He never married, never spoke much of family, but when they cleared his apartment, they found dozens of newspaper clippings, all marked at the edges with faint pencil notations. Still waiting. Deserves better. Don't forget. Roy stopped playing harmonica not long after. Said the notes didn't sit right anymore, that some songs were meant to be played once and left in the wind. Walter understood. He spent more time at home, but not alone. Eli came often, usually with Huck in tow. They sat on the porch and talked about things that didn't need conclusions. The shape of clouds, the sound of trains, what Scout might look like as a pup. One evening, as the sky turned orange behind them, Eli asked, "Do you think a dog can choose who they stay with?" Walter turned to him. "Why do you ask?" "Because Huck follows me everywhere, even when I'm mad, even when I don't talk to him." Walter nodded. "That's not about obedience, Eli. That's about love." The boy didn't respond, but he smiled the kind of smile that meant he'd remember the words long after Walter was gone. The last entry Walter wrote before his hands grew too tired to hold a pen was short. He wrote it on the back of a photo of Scout, taped it to the inside of his closet, and told no one about it. It read, "Some hearts sleep in the earth. Others keep watch in different ways. If you're reading this, keep the bench warm. Someone will need it." Years passed. The town changed in small ways. A coffee shop opened where the old post office used to be. The diner changed owners, but still served Roy's oatmeal special under a different name, the Quiet Veteran. But the Lighthouse remained, and so did the bench, and the marker, and the stories. Eli grew up, finished school, studied history, wrote his own book, eventually, not just about Scout or Walter or James Reed's, but about all of them, the ones who came back and the ones who waited, the ones who spoke and the ones who guarded in silence. When asked in an interview why he wrote it, he said, "Because I once met a dog who waited and a man who listened." Every year, on the day Scout passed, Eli returns. He brings flowers now. He brings Huck's leash, though Huck no longer walks it. He brings students sometimes. He brings questions. He brings laughter. And he sits on the bench, looking out to sea. And beside him, always, there's a little space. Enough for a dog. Or a memory. Or both. Scout waited, not because he was told to, but because some oaths are stronger than commands. Because loyalty, real loyalty, does not expire. What you just witnessed is not fiction. It is a reflection of countless true stories about veterans forgotten, promises kept only by those who cannot speak, and legacies that live on not in headlines, but in hearts. Here at Hero Paws 77, we believe in preserving these quiet truths, in honoring not just the warriors, but those who watched over them in silence. If this story touched you, let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts, your memories, even the name of a dog who never left your side. Subscribe if you believe these stories matter. Your support is what helps us keep the light on, one video, one memory at a time. Because sometimes the ones who wait the longest leave behind the stories that stay the longest. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story.